Did you have a pretty happy childhood? Hi there, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Syra, the show where I answer your questions about mental health, personal growth, and relationships. Today's question comes from Jyoti. Jyoti writes, "When I remember my childhood, I have only happy memories. Other people tell me bad things have happened, but I don't remember them. How can I know if I had a traumatic childhood? When I remember my childhood, I have only happy memories. Other people tell me bad things have happened, but I don't remember them. How do I know if I've had a traumatic childhood?" This is a really good question, and it's a question that comes up regularly with my clients in therapy. Um, because I practice depth psychology, which means we're going deep, right? We're talking about how your life experiences have formed you, the meaning and beliefs that you have about yourself and life. So it's not just about change your thoughts, change your actions. It's also about understanding how you got here, right? And one of the kind of I would say like gold mines of information is our childhood. We can learn a lot about ourselves from the first specifically 5 years, but also the first 10 years of life, because that's when the brain is forming, right? That's when our personality is kind of starting to form and develop and emerge. And you can learn a lot about yourself when you look at those early years and what was the context that you were marinating in. Right? Because brains are not formed in a vacuum, right? We are formed in context. We're in families, or we're maybe not in families. Maybe we're in the foster care system, or maybe, at an orphanage. Like there's so many different inputs that different kids have in those first 10 years, and they absolutely form our brains and our personalities. So to answer this question, I want to look at three things. The first is, I'm just going to say it directly, like life's a mixed bag. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what's called toxic positivity. And finally, I want to tell you a little bit about temperament and the children's temperaments and how that can impact their experience of trauma. So let's start with the first one. Life is a mixed bag. There's going to be great things that happen. There's going to be terrible things that happen. One of the challenges, and I was one of these people who said, I had a wonderful childhood. Like, my parents loved me. I was around my cousins a lot. There was always food on the table, and like everything was fine. So what's the problem? Well, my dad left my mom when I was 10. That's traumatic. My dad was actually violent when he was with my mom towards my brother. That's traumatic. They had a rocky relationship when he was there and when he was gone. That makes impact. Those things I had conveniently ignored and said, oh, that didn't really impact me. Like my mom was great. I didn't need a dad. But as I started doing some of my own growth work, I started to see how I had started to form beliefs about myself because of the choices that these adults had made. So I started to think maybe I was unlovable. And that's why my dad didn't keep in touch after he left. Which as an adult, you're like, no, that is not the reason. It's his thing. It's not your thing. But as a child, it was like, well, why doesn't my daddy want to be with me? Right? And those questions from a child's level of understanding can create like this despair inside of like, oh, I must not, maybe if he doesn't love me, can anybody love me? And again, this is not something that you think about consciously as a child. It just kind of sets in, and then you put it aside and say, no, I had a great childhood. I had a great childhood. So life is a mixed bag. There's going to be great things that happen in our childhood, and there's going to be terrible things that are happening in our childhood, even if our parents did all the right things, right? Even if our parents do all the right things, somebody's going to pass away at some point. Maybe a pet will die. Maybe you'll break a bone. Maybe someone in your class will go through a difficult experience and you're supporting them or you're their friend. You are going to see difficulties. And for the kids who their parents shelter them from those things, those are the hardest people to work with in therapy because they have zero skills on how to deal with how to bounce back from difficult things because they've never Their parents have never exposed them and allowed them to build that resilience and that grit over the years. They've just sheltered them. And so then they come into adult life and it's like, how do I deal with all of these disappointments? Because disappointment is like part of life, right? Part of being in relationship with humans is that they're going to disappoint you sometimes and they're going to let you down and your feelings are going to get hurt. And we need to know how to deal with that. And we need to start learning how to deal with that at a younger age. Some people never had to because life is great, everything is great. And one of the things I often hear is like, my parents never argued. And I remind people that maybe they never argued in front of you, but a long-term healthy marriage, there's going to be some disagreement. Maybe they weren't throwing things at each other, but for sure they disagreed. If it's an honest, open, healthy marriage, for sure they disagreed, right? So, and then what that does is when I now am in a partnership, a romantic long-term partnership, I don't know how to deal with conflict because I never saw it modeled to me of what healthy disagreement looks like because my parents never disagreed, right? That's the downside of not actually opening our children to the complexity, the mixed bag of life. So that's the first thing, is that life is a mixed bag. So yes, you might have had a happy childhood and probably some crappy things happen too. And it's okay that crappy things happen because that's life. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about is a concept called toxic positivity. Toxic positivity. So what is this? This is that person that says to you, oh, don't think about it. Why are you thinking about things that are so negative? Be positive. Look, you have this going for you, this going for you, this going for you. Life is good. Like, why are you thinking about these things? I agree that what we put our focus on grows. I absolutely agree with that. I also think that it's a bit of a gray area right now where some people are just trying to bypass their emotions altogether and get to happy without actually looking at the demons and the dungeons and all of that that's inside, right? You can't just bypass yourself because there's parts of us that are sad and parts of us that are angry, and that's a normal thing to be human, to have a range of emotions. And if you just bypass it to happy, happy, happy land, well, you're missing some of the richness and some of the learning opportunities that you could have if you let yourself feel those more difficult feelings. Also, it really invalidates other people's experiences. So if I'm telling you about something that's painful for me and you're just like, oh, look, don't worry about it. You have all these good things going for you and you'll do that. Like, it'll be fine. And if you do that, you're basically telling me that the pain I'm feeling isn't real or that I'm weak for feeling it. Probably not your intention, but that's how it can land on people, right? If you're that always up, always positive person, people around you don't feel like they can be real with you, because a real human is a full human, a whole human, not just a happy, 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 happy all the time human, right? So be mindful about that toxic positivity. And now that you know a little bit about it, you might start noticing it in your environment, that people who, the way that you can tell is that they don't feel grounded. So they're like really up here, like, oh, everything, blah, 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 and they don't feel weighted or grounded. There isn't anything here. It's all kind of like, it's all thinking, but it's not a lot of feeling. And what you have to know is every decision we make has to pass through the feeling centers in the brain. It's just the way our brain is designed. So in order to make the best and the wisest decisions for your life, you have to be willing to address and look at your feelings. So that's the second thing. Maybe you did have a pretty happy childhood, but to be willing to say, well, there was probably some things that weren't exactly perfect as well. And not to be that toxic positivity. Everything was fine. The final thing I wanted to talk to you about is temperament. The child's temperament. So there's this book called Orchids and Dandelions. And in that book, they talk about how they specifically talk about two different temperaments. Other research talks about more than two, but I like the way that they broke it up. So they talk about dandelions and orchids. So dandelions are the kids that, they bounce back. Like, you could step on a dandelion, it springs right back. You could dig out a dandelion, it comes back. For those of you who are gardening, as the spring arrives, you know what I'm talking about. They just keep coming back. They keep coming back and nothing can kill them. It's like, I remember last summer we were digging out the dandelions and it's like the roots are so deep and they'll come back and they're resilient. They've got grit and they will come back. And then there's the orchids. The orchids, if you use the wrong kind of water, you can kill them. Now, is an orchid better than a dandelion? Is a dandelion better than an orchid? They're just different kinds of flowers. And that's how many of us, like, we come in with a certain temperament. And many of us are dandelions and others of us are orchids. And so if you're an orchid, you're probably so if you're an orchid, you'll know this because people say you're too sensitive. Everything gets under your skin. You overreact. You're a drama queen. These are some of the things that are said to orchids because things really land hard on orchid children, right? So though two children in a family might have had the same shared experiences, if one of them has kind of an orchid temperament and one of them has a dandelion temperament, their understanding of those experiences are going to be qualitatively different. Qualitatively different, right? So an example, I remember when my dad left and then he came back for a bit, my sister and I were talking about, like, remember when he came back and I was telling my sister about like how we connected and and my sister just said, yeah, he came back, but then he left again. So her memory of that was that he left again. My memory of that was the time that we spent together while he was there. But she looked at that and same experience, right? But what stuck for her was different than what stuck for me. And memories are formed. So decisions are formed through the emotional center. Memories are also formed through the emotional center of the brain. You will remember things that were emotionally intense, whether emotionally positive, negative, like emotionally intense. So you will remember things differently also depending on your temperament. So those are the things I have to say about that question. How do I know if I had a traumatic childhood? You might have not had a traumatic childhood, but there may have been some difficulties, some trauma, and also with dandelions and orchids, caregiver response, right? So if you're an orchid and your parents know that you're an orchid and they give you that support, you're going to have a very different experience than if you're an orchid and nobody understands you and they're treating you like a dandelion. You have a very different childhood experience, right? So it might have been a happy childhood if your caregivers were responding to you in a way that you needed. And there's probably some bad things that happen too. So I would say for this question, it's always helpful to bring in someone from the outside, like not yourself, because we have very selective memory. So whether that's a professional, whether that's talking it through with a family member, like what were some of the pieces of my childhood that maybe I haven't filled in? And okay, because one of the things you said was other people tell me bad things happen. So one of the things I'll ask my clients is, okay, you said that this bad thing happened. Your grandma died when you were 3 and you were really close to your grandma. And I mean, you don't remember it, but think about a 3-year-old. Think about a 3-year-old that you know who's really close to their grandma and lives with their grandma. And suddenly their grandma's gone one day and nobody explains what happened. What might that do to a 3-year-old, right? So you're kind of, as an adult, able to go back now and say, oh, that was probably pretty painful and confusing for me as a 3-year-old of like somebody I love and now they're gone and nobody's talking about it, right? They don't want to take me to the funeral because they don't want to expose, like, it was probably painful, right? And as a child, what do? We put it away and we say, no, I'm not going to deal with that. That's too much. But in adulthood, it can come back again for healing. So those are my thoughts about that question. Hopefully it was helpful. Feel free to send in your question and I will see you next time. Bye.